In the fall of 1949, a young evangelist named Billy Graham pitched a tent in Los Angeles for what he hoped would be a modest 3-week revival. Attendance was sparse, and Graham was discouraged. Then, seemingly overnight, everything changed. William Randolph Hearst, the powerful newspaper magnate, sent a 2-word telegram to his editors: Puff, Graham. The next morning, headlines blazed with his name, and the tent filled. The revival stretched for weeks, and Billy Graham became a national figure. That moment wasn't just about media savvy. It was about the convergence of faith, family values, and political ambition. A convergence that would shape the rise of the religious right. In We Gather Together, The Religious Right and the Problem of Interfaith Politics, Neil J. Young traces how evangelical leaders like Graham helped build a movement that reached from the pulpit to the ballot box. In Partisans, Nicole Hemmer explores similar themes, focusing more on how media, religion, and family fueled the conservative revolution of the 1980s and 90s. Today, Nicole and Neil join us to talk about how political movements are born not just in campaigns, but in living rooms, churches, and family trees, and how the personal and the political have always been intertwined in the making of American conservatism. Welcome to Reunion, a podcast about how family history helps us understand the past and why it still matters today. This series is sponsored by the Center for Family History and Genealogy and the Family History Program at Brigham Young University, which offers the world's only undergraduate degree in family history. I'm Joey Stewart, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Christopher Jones. We're both assistant professors of history and faculty in BYU's Family History program. In each episode, we talk with scholars, educators, and storytellers who use family history to explore big questions about religion, race, kinship, and identity. Studying families helps us see what mattered most to people in the past and how those values shape the world we live in now. Family history is much more than names and dates. It is a way to explore memory, emotion, power, and connection. It gives historians a flexible method for understanding everything from slavery and migration to religious conversion and cultural memory. This is Reunion. We're glad you're here.
Nicole Hemmer is an associate professor of history and director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. Her work explores how right-wing media has shaped American political life in the mid-20th century to the present. She is the author of Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics, and Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s. Nicole is also a past co-host of the podcast Past Present and current co-host of This Day in Esoteric Political History, as well as host of A12, the best journalistic account of the white supremacist attacks on Charlottesville in August of 2017. Neil J. Young is a historian, writer, and podcaster whose work explores the intersections of religion, politics, and culture in modern America. He is the author of We Gather Together, The Religious Right and the Problem of Interfaith Politics, and Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right, a groundbreaking study of LGBTQ conservatives in American politics. Neil's commentary appears regularly in leading publications, including The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. He previously co-hosted the history podcast Past Present with Nikki and currently co-hosts the Political Junkie podcast with the historian Claire Potter. He also helped create the award-winning series Welcome to Your Fantasy. Neil holds degrees from Duke University and Columbia University and has taught at Princeton University. Thanks for joining us, Neil and Nikki. So both of your books explore how political movements are built, not just in public, not just in the political sphere, but also sometimes within families, within the walls of the home. Has anyone ever asked you about these connections before?
It's interesting. People haven't. And I think about the beginning of my first book, Messengers of the Right, where I actually start in the middle of my family with a conversation between my dad and I and the way that that relationship shaped my politics, shaped my scholarship. And so family had always been at the heart of shaping the political questions that I was asking, the scholarly questions that I was asking. But as much as family especially runs through my first book, like the family connections that run through conservative media in the Cold War era, nobody's really lit upon that as a lens of analysis. What about you, Neil?
Yeah, I would say the same. I never have received a question like this. And I have to say that when you even reached out to us and asked us to come and talk about our work through this framework, I sort of originally thought, well, I didn't even see the connection. And in a way, after I thought about it a little bit longer, I really appreciated this conversation that I knew you wanted to have, because it was like you were excavating out of my own work a framework and a logic and a connection through it that is implicit, but I don't think is explicit. We'll get into this more, I'm sure. But the way that I write about the family is often capital T, capital F, like the family as a place of, as a site of politics, this notion that's invoked for political ends. And yet the folks I'm writing about exist within families. And I mean, that's true for most people, but the families that they exist within and the biographies I write of them are highly instrumental and important to the work they did publicly. So I'm excited to have this conversation and to turn the implicit into the explicit as we think about what these families meant for these people and for Americans in general.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's something that Christopher and I have seen as trained historians who now largely teach genealogists how to do research and place their research within context, is seeing just how central families and family relationships and networks are to American culture, power, any sort of subgenre of history that we can think about. And Neil, my first question is for you. In We Gather Together, you write about Billy Graham's rise and the role his family played in shaping his public image. How did Graham's family contribute to his meteoric rise in global evangelicalism? And we can come back to this, but how has his family's influence continued today?
Well, I think probably a lot of people, to the extent that they know Billy Graham and his family in American life, think about especially his son, Franklin Graham, and the incredible prominence he's had in the Trump era in American politics, and thinking as of Graham as the father figure here. Billy Graham is the father figure here who spawns a bunch of children, and those children have different levels of prominence in American life and culture, and that's what the family dynasty is. But I actually think if we're going to talk about Billy Graham as part of a religious family dynasty, it really begins with his wife and his wife's father, his father-in-law. Graham came from a fairly modest background, and I think there's a lot of ways to imagine a different life of Graham where he was a small-town Baptist preacher who was nameless. And I think in a lot of ways that was his own personal ambition, but he marries this woman, Ruth Bell, who he goes to college with, Wheaton College, the evangelical Harvard as it's often referred to. And Ruth Bell's father, Nelson Bell, is an incredibly important medical missionary to China in the early 20th century and a very influential conservative Presbyterian who's involved in so much of the theological debates and wars of the early 20th century around American fundamentalism. And Nelson Bell is very ambitious. He's very connected. He is a huge benefit to Billy Graham and Billy Graham's initial rise to power, connecting him with the right people, providing important money in the early moments of his career, and really serving as a connector for him and someone who gives him credentials by association. And so I think it's important to think about Graham from that early moment in his life as building a dynasty out of his marriage to Ruth Graham and through his relationship with his father.
Yeah, I remember the great historian and biographer of Billy Graham, Grant Wacker. He was at an Author Meets Critics at a conference I was attending, and somebody asked, why did you interview Billy Graham? And he said, Billy has said a lot of things. I was much more interested in being in the living room with his wife. So how can we think not only about Billy Graham's connections through his in-laws and through his wife, but also the way that they presented as a stereotypical nuclear family in post-war America, with a father who worked and a wife and mother who was more willing to be in the background?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think they, in a lot of ways, fit within and also provided a huge public representation of that white traditional family that was valorized at mid-century. So they have 5 children. They're all sort of squeaky clean looking, really clean cut Southern family, the sort of patriarchy of the professional working public facing husband and the mother who tended to the children. It was way more complicated, and that was not at all what was actually happening within the home. Ruth Bell was incredibly smart, ambitious woman herself, and she ran the family. And by that, I mean she ran the family operations, the family business, including running the farm back in North Carolina. Billy Graham was hardly ever home. He traveled the world constantly. She oversaw the construction of this major farm that they built in North Carolina, but she was also really instrumental to a lot of the operations of the early Billy Graham Evangelistic Association and that building organization. And really, I think in a lot of ways, in these more conservative appearing families, this is what we often find, is that women wield power in ways that disguise that power but are fundamental to the public image of that family, but also in the holding up of a conservative model, how a family, and particularly how male patriarchal head operates in this sort of system.
Thank you. Nicole, your work similarly shows how conservative leaders in the latter half of the 20th century were shaped not only by the politics of family values and its relationship to the rise of the religious right or to the rise of the right more generally, but also by their own family networks. Can you say something about how those family ties helped them consolidate political power?
Those family ties worked in a lot of different ways. So I think of some of those big figures from the second half of the 20th century, people like William F. Buckley Jr., Rush Limbaugh, Pat Buchanan. They each come from fathers with very strong conservative patriarchs, right? Their dads were strongly conservative, deeply shaped their understanding of politics, and also served as the person they were trying to impress, the person that they were trying to get the attention of, and sometimes the person for whom they really push their politics to the limits for, in order to kind of both get their attention and to show that they can go just as hard as their dad went when they were growing up. Because these fathers, Rush Limbaugh's father, Pat Buchanan's, Bill Buckley's, were pretty far right in their politics. Pat Buchanan's father lionized Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain. Bill Buckley's father was an arch segregationist. And so there was this family dynamic that was shaping the way that they expressed their politics. Another way that family was shaping the conservative movement in this period is that, especially for conservative media activists, but not just conservative media activists, their work wasn't just about spreading ideas. They were building businesses, and these turned out to be family businesses. And so somebody like Clarence Mannion, who was a radio and television broadcaster in the Cold War era, his daughter came and worked to write his newsletter. In the case of William Regnery, who was a conservative book publisher, he spent years cultivating his son to take over the business. When his son was killed in a plane crash in 1979, he obviously grieved and paused and had to come up with a new plan. And that new plan involved his second son becoming the new person who was going to take over the family business. And so you see these lineages. The same thing is true for somebody like Brent Bozell, who was one of the early editors of National Review. He was a junior, and so his son, Brent Bozell III, becomes a significant conservative media figure. I think Brent Bozell IV might have gotten picked up on January 6th. So there's this way that it helps us to understand that the work that conservative activists and conservative politicians are doing isn't just politics, but it's about a particular industry. It's about a particular profession. And their children see this, and they see their parents making money. They see their parents developing a career path where they have influence and potentially fame, and they go into that same career path. I think that there's another way that family works too, and that is kind of going back to something Neil was saying about the way that the family structure is a message. It acts as a signal to audiences. And I think the clearest person that I can think of here is Phyllis Schlafly, who Neil writes about as well. It was really important that she was a married woman with 6 children because she was very non-conventional in her career. She was very active in politics. She was a working mother. She was a working woman who ran for office and who had this empire that she built over the course of decades. And her family, this is not why she had it, but that it functioned as a kind of defense against attacks that she would get from the outside of being non-conventional, even as she was pushing traditional values. And I think it's interesting to follow that line through as well, just as you could follow something like the Bozells and see the development of the conservative movement over the course of decades, right? From National Review into media criticism and cable television into influencer and radical right violence. You could follow the ways that families are used performatively in a similar way, from the way that Schlafly uses it to the 1990s, when the women who are sort of following after Schlafly, although Schlafly is still very active, women like Laura Ingraham and Ann Coulter, they don't get married. Laura Ingraham adopts children. Ann Coulter never has children. Rush Limbaugh never has children, right? There's this moment where it seems not to matter as much, this building of families, to now, when the number of particularly white children that you have and the pictures that you share surrounded by your giant white family has real political power and is used not only to promote a politics of white Americans having lots and lots of children, but to demonstrate a kind of, it's almost like a litmus test Like if you have more kids, then you are more politically aligned and you can prove it through the shape of your family. So I think all three of those ways of family works in the conservative movement as I've studied it.
Great. What role then do gender and maybe generational expectations play in how political, and Neil, if you want to jump in here as well, religious authority, how those things are passed down?
Well, I think that the male-headed family is a consistent sort of politics and a consistent political entity and also a consistent representation here in a lot of the families we're talking about, even including some of these prominent women activists. I mean, I would add Anita Bryant to this conversation, sort of a Phyllis Schlafly acolyte. But both Schlafly and Anita Bryant made such consistent reference to their husbands in their political careers and in their public appearances. Both of them used to, especially Schlafly, used to thank her husband for allowing her to be here. Like that's how she would begin her public appearances. And in a way, she was
high-level trolling, right?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. She was owning the libs before that was a thing, because it was both a nod to the traditionalism and the conservatism that they said they represented and believed in and lived their lives by. And it was also a way of, like, especially in the 70s, you know, skewering feminist and feminism. And so I think the patriarchy exists and presents itself even when it's not necessarily a male representative who is the public face of it. And I think that that's a consistent part of this story. It's also highly tied to the religious belief systems of the folks that we're talking about here. And it's worth saying aloud that mostly who we're talking about so far have been conservative Catholics and evangelical Protestants. And I think we could also include Mormon conservatives in this broad expanse of conservative activists through the middle of the 20th century to now. But I think there's real theological differences there. I think there's a general religious/cultural regard for ideas of male headship, of gender roles and complementarianism and all those sorts of things that play out culturally and religiously that are made explicit in a political discourse in these decades.
Just add that there is a level of gender performance that changes over time, right? That Phyllis Schlafly or somebody like Beverly LaHaye are performing this very traditional mode of womanhood, and that is in line with their message. By the time you get to the 1990s, again, with women like Ingram and Ann Coulter, they're performing gender differently, right? They're optimized for cable television and for this sort of provocative, youthful, sexy kind of conservatism. And those coexist in the conservative movement, often in tension with one another. And the women who are performing that particular version of provocative femininity or sexual femininity are also very outspoken against feminism and kind of have to be so, right? In order for right-wing women to occupy that space, the more that their lives fall outside of traditional patriarchal family expression, the more that they have to, through their words, disavow feminism as a force in the culture and as a danger to the family. So I think that that performance as it changes over time is really fascinating as well. And then you rock it back to trad wives by the time you get to the 20 teens and 20s.
Thank you both for those great answers. And I want to tie back to something a little bit earlier, thinking about how these families, as sources of religious and political power, they're often some of the first adopters, or at least really effective adopters, of radio, television, newsletters. So even things today like Substack or Instagram or TikTok. And I'm curious if this is something that can be tied back to family connections and trying to get a message across, or if it's something that can be, so the academic phrase would be performed, right? So it's, we are a heterosexual family with conservative male husband and a wife who is happy to be at home and kids who are great at school and play on the football team and are the cheerleaders and things like that. But they have a way of almost innately knowing how to present themselves to a community in a way that reinforces their own political power through their religious authority. This is getting convoluted. So essentially saying, how does performing one's role in a religious family contribute to the rise of showcasing oneself for political movements at the local or national or even international level?
I mean, the thing that I think of in response to this question, maybe a little outside of the exact question about authority and the performance of authority within families, but this idea of breaking into these new media and figuring out how to develop them, how to successfully present yourself over these new media. I do think that there is something related to both family and community that's worth thinking about. If you think about the media environment that we're in today, influencer culture, where the way that whether someone is trustworthy or somebody is someone you should follow, someone you should listen to, is through the way that they present in these various social media, how many followers they have, whether the people around you also trust them. And so families become sites not just of the creation of these types of media, but also of the spread of them. So if the mother or father brings home a newsletter and sets it on the coffee table in the 1960s and 70s, that then is going to get socialized throughout the family. And the family becomes a node through which this material is circulated, but then also in how it's passed along in community. Who do you trust? You trust the people in your family. You trust the people who are your neighbors. There's a network of influence that becomes very, very important to the building of conservative media from the 1950s all the way through the TikTok era. It's just that it's very slow growing in this earlier era where you have to literally pass the newsletter along. You have to literally pass the little paperback book along. Whereas today, not only is it mediated by much quicker media, but by an entire right-wing media ecosystem that helps to elevate the influence of particular people within it. But I do think that that idea of communities of trust that can be located in the family and located in the house and then expanded out beyond them does feel to me to be important to understanding the way that these networks grow.
I think there's two different ways I want to answer this. This helps us think really broadly here. I mean, one again is about family connections. I'm thinking about how you started this conversation with this notion of dynasty, because I do think power, privilege, and money is really important here when we're talking about how do you build an empire that shapes American life and politics. And so one thing I think about is, again, the influence of Nelson Bell on Billy Graham, and particularly the decision for Billy Graham in the mid-1950s to found Christianity Today, which was, for most of the 20th century, or at least the second half of it, the most important evangelical magazine in the country. And his father-in-law, Nelson Bell, had, in the 1940s, founded this thing called the Southern Presbyterian Journal, which was a publication which was, again, when Presbyterianism in the early 20th century was going through all these internal debates, the Southern Presbyterian Journal was founded by Bell to champion the conservative Presbyterian theology and politics. And that served as a sort of inspiration and a model that over a decade later, Graham builds out into Christianity Today, which becomes a hugely influential magazine that I think is in a lot of ways the foundation for bigger media empires within the conservative evangelical world that expand into television and into radio, which was already a big frontier for evangelicals, but especially into television and into social media and all that and the internet in the 21st century. But television is important here too. And I think about the example of someone that I don't think we've mentioned so far, which is Jerry Falwell, and the way in which Falwell really recognized the family as the source of what could make his television empire so much more successful. So he had this television show called The Old Time Gospel Hour. And in a lot of ways, it was like the radio gospel shows of the early 20th century. You just deliver a sermon, you have an altar call at the end, and that's what the show is. And it had a fine audience. You know, people watched it. But in the 1970s, Falwell starts wanting to get involved in politics. He really is itching to become a political influencer and to have a political movement that he's leading. But he cannot get his viewers, nor can he really figure out how to tie fundamentalist theology to things, tax policy or national defense or the Panama Canal, right? But he starts, and this makes sense in the 70s coming out of the 60s, he starts talking about the family. And that's a much easier connection for him to make with conservative evangelical theology. There's a way to make the family explicit in a sermon and then to politicize it in the 70s in a way that fits within this milieu. And his viewership explodes. I mean, it just goes through the roof. And he really recognizes, as other conservative activists are in this moment, that the family becomes this mobilizing topic that seems to seamlessly blend together theology and culture and politics in a way that really, really deeply resonates with their audiences and that builds out an audience that they didn't have before. So those are two different examples, but I think they really bring together or bring to our attention lots of different ways media is helping mediate this question about family and technology and media through these decades.
Have cited several examples today of individuals, of figures, of subjects in your book or respective books. I'm curious if there is a moment, or if there was a moment in your research for these projects where an individual's family story illuminated or revealed something that was surprising to you, some unexpected point about the broader movements that you all write about.
This is a great question. And one of the moments that I think about actually touches on a topic we haven't talked a lot about yet, which is gay rights and homosexuality, which I think is central to this conversation about what are seen as threats to the family during this period, how family is leveraged against the civil rights of other people. But in the papers of Clarence Mannion, he was very close friends with Phyllis and Fred Schlafly, and they had sent along to him a letter that they had written to their son. Basically, I don't think at that point he wasn't out. But I think that they understood that there was something different about him. I think they may have suspected that he was gay and that there was a kind of falling out that was happening in the family and that they were wrestling with this quite intensely inside the family. And because it is a patriarchal and kind of authoritarian family, they're drawing a line and saying, you will not be part of this family if you continue down this path. And the reason that I found that letter very affecting, first of all, because you could see a family that was trying to reconcile a set of values and a set of politics that they developed with a very real experience of, well, I've lived my entire life saying that this is a bad thing. And now this bad thing is associated with my son. And now I have to decide between these sets of political values and religious values I've developed and what I do about my child, who I love and who I've raised. And so they're dealing with that. And I think not dealing with it particularly well, but it's affecting to see a family sort of work through this. But I thought that it was also an important moment because it allowed you some insight into the private world of the Schlafly family in a way that I don't think we usually got. Like Phyllis Schlafly was someone who leveraged her family quite a lot politically. And that is different from the private life of her family. And the fact that, and Neil, I think you can speak much more to this because of your more recent book, but I just think that the way that conservatives privately dealt with gay men and women within their families and within their circles was important because it was something that you couldn't see from the outside. What you saw from the outside were their anti-gay declarations. What you then saw on the inside is, in some cases, just acceptance of their gay family members and their gay friends and their gay coworkers. And in some cases, real isolation and a real discrimination. I don't know, Neil, what do you think about, because you've written so much about gay conservatives?
I was going to talk about the Schlaflys as well. So I'm glad you did. Also because I didn't know about that letter. And that's really amazing. And I think that one of the things I was thinking about was both gay children and also divorce. Those are the things that I think are consistent patterns through so many of these folks and families that we're talking about. So with the Schlaflys, it's a gay son. There's actually other families that are less known, but are also important in the world of these conservative politics and particularly anti-gay politics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s who, like, not surprisingly, in their big broods have one or two children who are gay and they have to deal with that or not deal with that in some sort of way. There's a story that is in my second book about gay conservatives of where the Reagans pull their friend Marvin Liebman aside. Marvin Liebman is this incredibly important conservative fundraiser who's closeted for most of his life. And they pull him aside at a dinner party, I believe at the Buckleys, if I'm remembering correctly, and ask Marvin Liebman about their son, Ron, who does ballet. And they're worried that because he's a ballet dancer, he's gay. And Marvin Liebman assures them that Ron Reagan is not gay. But divorce is a pretty big part of a lot of these families as well. I think most notably and most embarrassingly for Anita Bryant. And divorce pretty much spells the end of her political career. And so that's a way in which I think it's interesting to think about this, how gay children don't derail one's public image, but divorce does, or at least for most of the period we're talking about. Probably not true today.
It's interesting. I mean, if I could jump in, is that only true for conservative women? Because I also think about Reagan and Gingrich and all of these people who have just a number of divorces under their belts and a number of affairs as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, in the case of Reagan, his having been divorced was a huge, huge hurdle that he had to overcome, especially with evangelical conservatives who in 1979 are like, we're not going to go with the movie star who's on his second wife. But yet it's able to be, especially because he's remarried and the sort of family is coherent and cohesive again, it's able to be unfolded into a public biography that works for 1979, 1980. Obviously, it works for a lot of other conservative men over the course of the following decades who actually do get divorced, such as Gingrich. But I think, if we were going to look at the historical pattern here, I think the judgment falls much more heavily on conservative women who go through divorce. I think that maybe would not be the case today because there are no rules today, or at least not a consistent ethic from conservatives about these issues. But I do think this specter of divorce seems to have operated differently for a lot of these conservative activists than having a gay child has.
This is super fascinating. And I think what both of your comments highlight well is something that Joey and I are regularly working with our students to see. And that is that the ideal of the family in a given community, the way in which family is performed, to use a word that has been mentioned a few times today, is often at odds or frustrated in its idealized way by the reality of family experiences, right? That butt up against those sort of ideals that a community has in mind. And so when teaching family history courses here at BYU, we regularly are talking with our students about the skeletons that they find in their own families' historical closets, right? And so how to grapple with those. What does this mean for your family, for the legacy of these people that they've left you, for how you understand your family relationships with those individuals? And it can be a really, really tough thing for not just students, but for these political figures that you all have mentioned as well.
Oh, I think that's fascinating work because, of course, all families have skeletons in the family tree, and finding out about those skeletons, I think, is part of coming to terms with who you thought you and your family were and the reality of who you and your family were. And then also just the reality of everyone's just trying to make things work. And we can all have a set of values and ideologies, but when the rubber meets the road, people make decisions that are about how are we going to make our lives work, whether it's an unexpected pregnancy or an uncle nobody talks about or whatever it is. As historians, I think we're pro figuring out what those skeletons are and trying to reconcile them. But it can be psychologically and emotionally a real challenge because we draw so much of our identities from the stories we're told about our families.
I wouldn't say recoiling, but I'm certainly putting my finger on this phrase we're using, like skeletons. I mean, I get it. That's the way we talk about these things, but I also think that's really loaded with a set of judgments that are in large part shaped by the politics we're talking about here. That said, I think we could really expand our notions of complication here, if maybe that's a better way to put it. Alcoholism, mental illness. There's all sorts of ways I think families have really complicated challenges that they wrestle with. And many of those, if not all of them, don't fit within the particular model of family that's being upheld as a public image, but also as a politics to advance. And yet almost every family that we're talking about here is touched by one or all those things, which of course they are, because every family is, just by the nature of people are complicated and people have all sorts of different things that happen in their lives. What are the things that are easily enfolded in particular narratives that are consistent with the worldview and politics of these actors? And what are the things that can't be folded in, or that a new narrative has to emerge in order to incorporate them? I think alcoholism was something that was easier to keep hidden. Like there's a narrative that's available in a way that one had to be developed for the gay son or the gay daughter in the 70s and the 80s. Like they had to reach for a new way of talking about that because it was predicated on a sort of openness and a sort of cultural shift that just was more recent. And teenage pregnancy, I'm thinking about Sarah Palin's daughter, Bristol Palin. I think a lot of liberals thought this was some sort of gotcha moment. Sarah Palin's daughter got pregnant. Like, see, it's all a sham. And of course, it was perfect for a conservative worldview and a conservative politics of, no, we keep the baby, right? Like, we bring that baby into the family, and this isn't right, and it shouldn't have happened, but we will make it right through the protection of life and the love that's extended, and also the expectations will continue to hold up. So I don't know. I think there's so many interesting ideas at work here, which is probably why all of us want to talk about and write about these things.
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken about thinking about the expectations that we can have for family histories. And this is something that can be a particularly loaded thing. It's something Christopher and I have certainly discovered in teaching genealogy and how to uncover one's family past. But I'm curious how you all, as educators, either within classrooms or to the public, help folks to reframe concepts of family away from, as you said before, Neil, capital T, capital F, the family, towards these are families who have a favorite college football team and a meal that their dad makes in the summer, or in another way of thinking about the family beyond ideals and thinking about how the ups and downs of everyday family life shape the conservative movements that you all write about.
Great question. I would say that part of it is just reminding students and reminding our readers and reminding the people we talk to who tend to see political actors as almost like pieces on a board that are moving around, who see them through the lens of their political goals and their political machinations in many cases, see them through that lens and then determine, is this a good person or a bad person, depending on whether or not their goals align with the person who's learning about them. And then just pushing to have them understand whoever they're studying or whoever they're looking at as whole and real people with a set of ambitions, with a set of experiences, a lot of which won't be preserved in the historic record in any way, but that these are whole and real people, and understanding them as whole and real people first is an act of historical empathy, which we have to practice as people who are looking at and thinking about and studying the past. But also, it is not about absolving them of the choices that they make in their lives or the causes that they have served or promoted, but it is about understanding that it is real people who built the world that we live in. It is real people who made decisions that we disagreed with, who have values that we disagree with. They're not caricatures or monsters. And I think that there's a real value in understanding that, because I don't actually think you get very close to an accurate understanding of the past if you're just thinking in terms of caricatures or chess pieces in politics.
I love that. And I think that is what I was going to say, or bridges to what I was going to say about the importance of biography in history, which is not something necessarily all historians believe in or do in their work, but I'm just drawn to people's stories. And I think that people's stories are so important for us understanding a bigger picture of who they are and how they operate and the things they do in this world that we know about or that we see as shaping our life. And I think to engage biography is to deal with the family history, right? Whatever it means for each person. But I think it matters that Jerry Falwell's father was an alcoholic who died when he was really young. I'm not a psychologist and I'm not writing psychoanalytic history, but I think that that's an important part of his biography that shows up in different ways that I, as a historian, can evaluate. And I think it's not surprising, or that's not even the right way to put it, but I think then that's important because then you can talk about Falwell's own politics, that you can see a sort of connection to a series of traumas in his early life that I think it's fair to make connections from, or to at least analyze those as being potentially relevant. That's just one example here. And then the other thing that I was going to say is I think there's a lot of work I have to do in reminding myself as a historian to not privilege, or not even privilege, but to not only think about the family through a very particular framework, but to remember that there are all sorts of families and all sorts of arrangements that people have and that people pursue and that people exist among. And all of those constitute family and families, particularly for those living in them. And so I think sometimes, even as we maybe write against or don't agree with the politics of, we can find ourselves regurgitating and reinstilling a set of assumptions in our own work that I think it's really important to remember not to do. Like, I was reading through my book this morning in preparation for this conversation, a book that was published 10 years ago and written even longer ago. And there were ways I was talking about certain things that I was just, gosh, like, push back a little bit here, Neil. Think about the words you're using and the framing choices you're making. Yeah. And I think the family is one of those we can invoke in an uncomplicated way, even as we're wrestling with the politics of the family in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as like a thing we know is contested.
Something that comes to mind as you're saying that is sometimes students, professional historians, they'll see one person as, again, because we've talked about performing, where they don't really believe something politically or they don't really believe something religiously. They're using it in some other capacity. Is this something that you weigh in your own work where you're trying to keep in mind they firmly believed this and thought they were doing the right thing, even as you may disagree with the way that they went about it, or because they couldn't see at the end from the beginning what came of their decisions that they made because of their political or religious world?
This is a question that I get a ton, and you probably get a ton too, Neil, which is like, but did they really mean it? Did they believe it? We get it all the time. And especially when I'm talking about contemporary figures, I'm like, I can't answer that for you. I can't tell you what Tucker Carlson believes or what Rush Limbaugh believed, because it's so tied up with the industry that they're part of and the cash that they're generating. And yeah, I'm sure they believe some things and don't believe other things. And it's just really hard to parse unless you have deep archival records, whether they believed it or not. And so to a certain extent, I think sometimes I bracket that and I say, maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is what are the consequences of the things that they promoted. But I do think when you have deep archival records, you can sometimes see how people develop their beliefs. And I do think that that is worth taking seriously, even if you don't have kind of a clear view into someone's heart or into their documentary record. I think that it is worthwhile thinking about, even if this person doesn't necessarily fully believe this, a bunch of people do. I actually think this is really important for secular writers who are writing about religion. I think there can be a tendency to think of it as either instrumental in the world of politics, like this politician professes this because it gets him or her something, or as something that is simply emotionalism and that isn't deeply considered. And my experience growing up Catholic was not that, right? I both got the deeply spiritual appeal of the smell of incense filling up a church, how it felt to be moved by sunlight coming in through a stained glass window, or just being in silence and meditation and communion with other people. That is something that is real. And people don't just believe it as a kind of delusion. They don't just believe it because they're emotional and unintellectual. People have real felt beliefs and experiences that shape those beliefs and real commitment to those beliefs. And even if we can't adjudicate whether each and every person that we write about came to it with a sincere and honest heart, I think that it is very much worthwhile understanding the appeal of certain ideas and practices and identities to people when we're writing about them, because otherwise you just don't get beneath the surface. And it feels like half a job if we haven't done a little bit more of that digging.
I get this question all the time, and from every sort of folk. I mean, podcast interviewers to a person on the street. And in one way, I kind of don't really understand why this is a question people ask. But I also do understand, because I think there's this idea that, if we can point out the hypocrisy here, then we can just take the whole thing, we can dismiss the person entirely. And of course, I don't think that's how it works at all. We don't need people to be consistent moral actors in order for the actions they take to have profound consequences for the world we live in. I also think it assumes that belief is a thing that's set in stone and is consistent over life. And that just isn't true at all, nor is that interesting. And if it were, then it's not a site of historical analysis. So change over time is at the heart of what we do as historians. So to see an idea shaping in a person's mind, and whether it's in the archival record or whatever, that's what we're here to examine and to think about and to historicize. And I think we can wrestle with ideas of belief and sort of certainty and what that means for folks who promote ideas in public. But I think that there's something so much more interesting about the complicated life that people live and the complicated set of values and ideas and beliefs that people wrestle with internally, and what that looks like in terms of their public forum that I'm much more interested in. And I just think that that's a very reductive question. Again, I understand why people ask it, but it is not at all something that can be answered easily, or the answers I want to give to it don't seem to be what people are looking for there. But I think it's a question that people will continue to ask, all the more so right now. I think the nature of our world and technology and the way people present themselves is only going to make that question more top of mind. But we need way more imaginative and thoughtful ways of answering it.
We like to conclude each episode by asking our guests about a book that they've recently read that has ignited their historical imagination. And I want to clarify that this doesn't need to be a work of academic scholarship here. We've had guests mention children's books that they've recently read, various genres of fiction, while some have critical scholarship that they've read. But it can really be anything that you've read recently that has maybe shaped the way or caused you to rethink something.
It's interesting because I've been in this big kind of movie phase lately. And so as soon as you asked this question, I was like, oh my gosh, we should talk about the movies that have broken open our historical imagination. There's some very good movies that have come out this year that are great for sparking this question of imagination. I'll name 3: Train Dreams, One Battle After Another, and Sinners. Deeply historical movies that open up so many fascinating questions. The book that I've been reading, though, that maybe plays around with the line of historical, but has definitely gotten my brain really revving up lately, is Bridget Reed's Little Bosses Everywhere, which is a history of multi-level marketing. But behind it is this other idea of you get to be your own boss, and how that idea of entrepreneurship and not being just another cog in the machine has been a real driver of Americans' imagination, what it means to control your own life. And this is in part her analysis, but then also part of what lots of other people are working on as well, doesn't actually lead you to liberation at the end of the day, financial, political, or otherwise, and has in fact resulted in this gig economy in which not only are you not really your own boss, even though you're presented as this idea of having command over your own time, but you are even more trapped in a way by algorithms, by inconsistent income, by product that you do not control in any way, and often by scams, which I think, are not new to American history, but we certainly live in an economy that has been scamified in recent years. The combination of scams and gambling in the U.S. economy have really, I think, immiserated lots and lots of people. And so even though the book is only about MLMs and multi-level marketing, I think that core idea that's captured in the title of it, everybody being their own boss, is something that I've just been thinking about a lot lately, and thinking about how embedded that is in the American idea of freedom and the way that freedom is constantly undercut by capitalism.
That sounds amazing. I don't know that book, so moving it to the top of the list. I want to share something a little bit different, but it's the best book I read last year, and I think it's the best book I've read in the last decade, and definitely one of my top 2-3 books all time, and I'm pushing it on everyone, so I'll push it here. It's called Yellowbird: Oil, Murder, and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country. It's by Sierra Crane Murdoch. She's not a historian, she's a journalist, but it is this absolutely incredible story about this Native American woman in North Dakota who basically solves a murder that happened on her reservation that's tied to an oil company that's there. And it is a just absolute page turner of a book. I was devastated when I finished it. I mean, it was I just did not want it to end, and was so sad when it was over. It's beautifully written. It's incredibly reported. I think she spent more than a decade working on this story, embedding herself with these people, especially her protagonist and the community, and just doing such unbelievable research, but also folding in so much important history, particularly indigenous history and environmental history and a history of the West, especially the history of Native Americans. Indigenous history is one that I feel so embarrassed that I have such a thin knowledge of as someone who holds a PhD in US history, and something that I'm feeling just really compelled to do something about personally in my own reading. But it is just this beautiful and really impressive work of investigative reporting with really, really deep and beautifully rendered histories of all these important things of American life, including capitalism and the oil economy and environmental degradation and Native American destruction in this book you cannot put down. It's a murder mystery and it's an investigation, and it's all the things in the most gorgeous prose you've ever encountered. And so I love that book. As someone who's not an academic anymore, or at least not employed as one, and whose writing is continuing to evolve in a much more public facing way, it was such a great book for me to read of the kind of work I want to do going forward, that's not less scholarly, but less academic, but still does important work for helping big audiences understand really, really important histories in service of a really gripping narrative about something that engages people. So I love that book. I cannot recommend it enough. I want to read it again, but I'm also sort of frightened to pick it up and just want to cherish that singular reading experience I had with it. But y'all read it immediately.
Nicole Hemmer, Neil J. Young, thanks so much for joining us on Reunion.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining us on Reunion. Family history isn't just about names and dates, it's about relationships, and how those relationships have shaped laws, power, and the structures that govern our everyday lives. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really helps others find the show. We'll be back soon with more discussions about why family history matters, because family history is history.